Hey guys, it's Josh here. After 3 years? Let's talk about what I've been doing since then, and the games that I've explored, and a few little comments and things that I've picked up along the way. So, without further ado, we'll go past where we left off. So essentially, Rhesus was the system that I'd been talking about the most, just based on obviously how it interacted with narrative and everything like that. And we sort of come across to a little sheet that I'd made up for my players to follow along with. There is one thing that probably I took from the whole experience of Rhesus, which was having one page that had most of the rules written down on it for the characters and players to obviously reference while we played. And that was definitely something that I took into the other games that I eventually sort of explored. So when we revisit, obviously, 5th edition D&D, I had come across, obviously, like a lot of people, this term called the OSR, which is the Old School Renaissance. And essentially, that was sort of scaling back everything, the system bloat, all the extra rules, and bringing it back to the fundamentals of what D&D was, potentially in the beginning, but more so just as an offshoot to how the game was progressing and slowly getting more and more rules and things like that, as opposed to, less and more freedom. So that really sort of started making me sort of shift in the direction of like games like Knave or Can or Black Hack or, many different games, Five Torches Deep, all that sort of stuff. But in the end, I think the thing that maybe started to make me sort of look elsewhere after that was still this desire to want to focus on potentially games that could be applicable in a lot of different directions without much work at all. So it was definitely starting to shift back to, I still want a system that can be used in many different genres. Primarily wanted to keep it sort of pulpy action, but perhaps with more sort of rules to cover certain things that perhaps my players were sort of saying, hey, we would like to see more things like this. And Rhesus really wasn't sort of fulfilling the roles for the players. I think they were searching for a little bit more as well. And my development just as a referee and as a game designer sort of slowly started shifting me across to other areas. So obviously had explored a lot of the OSR titles there. I think I'd still wanted to keep everything story focused. Really wasn't as interested in just straight dungeon crawl, XP for gold, all that stuff. So I was still left, wanting for a better term. So again, I'm still actually running a lot of 5e, primarily to do with sort of how I view the game at the moment, which is more so about tactical, probably not dungeon crawling, but definitely sort of focused on things of combat nature. Well, I've got a game coming up at the moment, which is really sort of focused on characters from the Underdark and things like that. But that's really only where I'm sort of sitting with 5e at the moment. So in between that, I'm starting to get a taste for games like I'd sort of dabbled in Twilight 2000 and Forbidden Lands. So I'm starting to get these notes of, okay, there's, a bit more simulation of like these mechanics feel like, okay, this is starting to now, immerse myself because of the mechanics, not in spite of the mechanics. So that was definitely a few things were starting to go light bulb. And so once it hits about 2023, a little bit later, I come across a system called Basic Roleplaying. And this is a real breakout moment for me where I go, and now I'm starting to see, okay, you don't need classes. You can have a game that is fully formed, still has a level of detail that allows things to feel like they have weight. So things take time, and obviously we can show that in a narrative sense with games like Rhesus, but until there's something there for players to grab onto, it can feel like a lot of GM fiat a lot of the time, which again depends on the context of what we're trying to do. So when we talk about Fate Accelerated a little bit later in the video, we'll sort of touch back on that. But BRP, or basic role playing, was the thing that started to codify. Okay, like now we can have a skills based, very sort of, I wouldn't say granular, but definitely something that focuses on attention to detail and having characters that have multiple facets that are just not sort of like a very abstract nature. It's definitely more defined, which allows obviously players and the referee to really start to hone in on what kind of game we want to tell and play. And so with BRP, I start exploring all these different facets of, okay, I would like to try this idea. I would like to try that idea. And things that maybe would have been sort of, a one shot or a two shot in Rezus started to become a lot more fleshed out. Sci-fi horror, we've got, things that start to codify why the BRP system was starting to stick with me a lot more. Things that I was struggling to grok with in D&D, which was scaling hit points and, invincible armor class, and, even just the idea of, trying to codify things like spell slots and all that stuff. The game that D&D was trying to be was definitely more of a game. It wasn't really trying to simulate as much, I wouldn't say reality, but again, there were just certain things in BRP, like having, skills listed as a percentage, so that if you were tested against something that was out of the ordinary, if I've got a 65% chance of using my broadsword against, this goblin, then I already know straight away, based on my character sheet and obviously the environment that the referee, who's me, has set up, I already know that I've got a 65% chance of hitting them. So there's just a lot of things that I was like, okay, so we've got an innovative core mechanic. And at the time, obviously, because it was derived from RuneQuest, which was obviously a groundbreaking system, had brought forth a lot of things, mainly sort of the percentile thing. Obviously, with XP in most other games, it's awarded sort of arbitrarily. So if you kill a monster in 5e, you get XP. And so, in the words of the great Matt Colville, what a game rewards is what it encourages. And so now D&D is something that I look at as more of a monster hunting game. And maybe, you could wiggle it around by doing milestone and things like that and more narrative things. But BRP made it very clear that this is a game about primarily humans and the human scale, which can be altered. But it said, characters learn by doing things. And, if you can successfully complete something, then at the end of the session or the adventure, you can roll against it and see if you level up. And so there's a lot of things in the background. Health doesn't go up. Your skills take a long time to level up. So it's this horizontal sort of, progression as a character, as opposed to this vertical, once you get to level 10, it's basically not interesting anymore. Whereas with BRP and by extension Mythras, the game that we'll talk about later, things are always interesting. There's always stakes in combat. People are very likely to die on their first combat as well as their 10th combat. There is that thing where, a lot of these issues that I had with 5e, they were pretty much, as I was reading through, I was like, I agree with that. I agree with that. That solves this. That solves that. Again, I won't say it's the perfect system, but it is the system that gives you a lot of tools to be able to hone in on exactly what you want out of a simulationist game, which was something that, I'd never come across before. It had really only been D&D, Rezus, and a couple other games that were sort of more focused on, playing the system as opposed to, focusing on a story. Obviously, Rezus being one that was lighter and could keep with the story. But again, it was something that made me think, okay, I've got something here that I can use to tell stories of, I had a system, or I had a session which was World War One Australian and British soldiers in Australia fighting off zombie hordes and vampires and werewolves. And yes, you could reflavor that from D&D, but there was just so many things where I was like, oh, I can just pluck that right out of there, and I can use that, and I can change the skills to fit what I need to. And the skill-based part was just so easy and so simple, and reminded me a lot of Elder Scrolls, which really was, the more you dig down, the more you find out that there's a lot of things that Elder Scrolls took from RuneQuest, which was the derivative, the thing that was derived into BRP. Um, so when we talk about this is really where we start to get into the weeds with my exploration into D100 games. So I get BRP and I'm left wanting more. So more so, not so much because I'm not satisfied, but it's definitely like, oh, this is really interesting. I'd love to see how this is applied to other things. And again, I pretty much if I had the island books, if I was left on a desert island, it would probably be BRP at this point, just because of how easy it is to scale up and down with rules. If I wanted to, and I was introducing someone to role-playing games for the first time, you could literally just hand them a basic role-playing sheet with all of the stats filled out, and they could say, okay, I've got a climbing skill of 40%, and I've got a law of strange arcana of 55, and oh, my crossbow skill is like 80, so I must be really good with that. So that part is really simple, but in terms of, say, introducing them to the idea of role-playing games, you could literally just do percentages all day and just say, look, you're trying to do this, that's about a 35% chance, and then slowly start to incrementally ramp it up, depending on what's required. But BRP was so interesting to me at the time, and it still is. There's a lot of things that I eventually took those lessons that I learned from that, and really started to bring it to another game that I've been hearing a lot about, which was Mythras, which essentially is we'll call it a revision and sort of a condensing of a lot of things, a lot of lessons learned from BRP, which was primarily things around how skills worked, how the attributes linked together. But before I purchased that, I've been reading a lot more about RuneQuest and particularly the world of Glorantha. But I'd had a chance to obviously purchase the Humble Bundle that was released for RuneQuest by Chaosium, and taken a big stab at that. Had a look at a lot of things, and I thought, wow, this is really interesting. The mechanics were similar to BRP, but with a few other things like the dreaded strike ranks of RuneQuest. But there was definitely something in there where I sort of put a pin in it, and I said, I'll come back to that when I'm ready. And the more I'd sort of read up about if I was to try doing something with RuneQuest, I could use BRP. And that was really cool, but it was definitely something where I'm like, okay, there's a lot of work that's involved in that. What else is there on option, on display? And a lot of people were recommending Mythras. Obviously, Mythras as a toolkit, very similar to BRP, where you pull things out that you don't need. So in, say, BRP, they give you options for sanity, for superpowers, for fatigue. And if there's games where that's not important, so if I'm playing, an 1800s, Western frontier ranger, sanity is not important, so we don't use that. But maybe fatigue might be, or if I'm playing street level cyberpunk, then obviously I'm starting to use. Okay, I've got some powers that can be reskinned, or if I'm using a character that wants to turn his arm into a machine gun, there's ways to incorporate that using the rules in the book. So Mythras really starts to represent where I'm heading in terms of how the simulation is treated in terms of both enjoyment at the table and also how it fits narratively. And that's the thing that tends to separate BRP and Mythras, is once you start getting into, I'd probably say the deeper mechanics in terms of combat and things like that. BRP does offer a lot of options there, but Mythras does it in a way that's more satisfying to explore at the table. So both systems have attack and parry rules. So if I'm coming at you with a sword, you don't just stand there and let me sort of wail on your armor class. You have an active role in trying to deflect or trying to, get out of the way. So there's something that when you're at the table, as opposed to just playing it willy-nilly, when you're at the table, the other person's still involved in what happens, which is something that D&D doesn't really do. It's very much just you're trying to hit a wall until it breaks, whereas this one's definitely you actually get the feeling that two people are having a fight. Um, so Mythras was definitely one of those things where during combat, if I attack you and I do really well and you do really poorly, there's certain things that now are triggered called special effects, which again, in the words of Black Lodge Games and Inwells, they're the things that really make Mythras stand out in terms of a D100 game. They provide mechanics that flavor the narrative. So if I hit you very successfully and you fail to parry or get out of the way, I'm going to be going for your head and I'm going to maximize damage. And it's in the narrative, I'm swinging my sword and head just goes straight off, So there's just so many interesting things that can happen at the table because the mechanics are there to enforce it or to encourage sort of this creative play. And so we sort of jump right back to Rhesus and like, okay, we've got these mechanics that we can use to sort of tell a really cool story. And then this maturity that I'm finding as I'm sort of getting, more experience with things where, all right, I want to really tell a human story and I want things to mean something and I want to have stakes and I want things to take a while to do. So if I want to get really good at something in real life, it takes, 10, 15 years to get really, really solid at something. And there's ways of making that satisfying in the game, but it was just having the rules there to be like, oh, I can do that. That's cool. So that's where we're sort of at the moment, where I'm using the Mythras rule set with the Humble Bundle that I purchased from Chaosium to run games of RuneQuest and in exploring the world of Glorantha, which has been an absolute, I suppose it's been quite a mental task, sort of like climbing Mount Everest or Carafin, if you know what I'm talking about. But it's definitely something that watching how the rules interact with the world is something that I hadn't really dabbled in before. And so having really only sort of explored maybe like the more narrative element and gamist element, I was sort of blinded to how you could use mechanics to simulate a reality as opposed to just sort of saying, okay, well, I've got certain things in, say, a 5e game that it's really only there just for sort of like a flavor sort of thing. Whereas games like BRP and Mythras, they have, these little narrative elements where it's like, okay, you've got passions. Passions are things that can be used to inspire you to do certain things. And they might be your loyalty to the king or your hatred for a rival clan or potentially even a love of a family member. So things like that provide mechanical values that can be used obviously for the player's benefit, but also as a way to reinforce what the character stands for, which was really, really interesting. So I might do a little bit more of a deep dive if you guys are interested in talking about, what the hell is Mythras? Can you say more about BRP? But primarily now where I'm sitting at is this junction where I really enjoy games that give me a lot of tools that I can use, again, with a bit of work to get the results that I want. And so I've found that in terms of speed of, we'll call it speed of acquirement. So with BRP and Mythras, because the rules are so clean and precise with regards to the percentiles, it makes it so easy to grasp and pick up. And within sort of 2 sessions, I was already starting to make things. Whereas it took me, it took me a fair while to make something in 5e because there was so many things where it was maybe, a +5 is actually, plus 25% because each point is 5%. Whereas BRP was so clean in terms of its presentation, its rules and mechanics, so that it made it really easy for me to go, okay, well, already, if I know that a human size is between, 10 to 18, that means that if something's twice their size, then we're already looking at, numbers that are double that. So there was a nice sort of analog that I could start to build things from. And I think that's probably the main takeaway from the last 3 years is really starting to sort of keep myself in these universal systems where I can apply many different sort of levers and pulleys to make sure that it's the game that I want to run. and not sort of this. Again, D&D is still a fun game to run up until a certain point, but it really only does what it does. And there's just times where either it's immersion breaking or perhaps it's not telling the story that I want or in the genre that I want. And BRP and Mythras were sort of those games that said, here's a bunch of rules that you can do whatever you want, and we've provided equipment lists for everything from caveman to sci-fi futuristic. We did a really interesting psychological sci-fi horror, and that couldn't have gone better because the mechanics really made everyone feel like, wow, this feels like I'm feeling what my character feels because the mechanics are telling me, which was just something that we just all were sort of, looking around like, this is really like bizarre that these rules are making like there's a connection that happens between what's happening on the paper versus what's happening up here, as opposed to just talking to each other, which again you're going to be doing anyway, but it's more so, it's less based on GM fiat and it's more based on what's happening mechanically that makes it a bit easy to grasp. And also just in terms of being able to teach someone, it's less about, because some players aren't really comfortable with like direct role playing or storytelling. So having that, mechanical element helps them sort of say, well, I'd like to try and climb because my climb skill's great. And, everyone else's, they might fall and then the heist is over. So that really, there was just a lot of light bulb moments with BRP and by extension Mythras that just made me go, okay, there's many ways to skin the cat RPG wise. And they're just a couple of different approaches that provided, a really clean element so that I could model things using rules and make it work. The last thing I want to talk about in the next 2 minutes is a more recent game that I found out about, which was obviously I'd heard of Fate a very long time ago, and I'd sort of looked at Fate Core and I thought, yeah, I think Reese's can do it a little bit better. I could skip a little bit forward and I start looking at a game called Fate Accelerated, which is essentially a boiled down version that feels a lot like Reese's, but provides just one extra element, which was the idea of fate points and, this meta currency of, things working because a player wants it to happen, or, the characters' elements and all their aspects get brought right to the forefront, including their flaws, which was another thing that really sort of made me go, that's another, really interesting thing to make work. So that's really sort of a quick note on Fate Accelerated. That sort of, it carries the torch from how I felt about Reese's, which was about trying to keep things like running clear and concise with, easy to understand mechanics and everything to tell an interesting story. But yeah, look, for the last maybe 30 seconds, we'll just talk about, what the plans are for the channel. Obviously, when we talk about the Game Impala name, what I will be probably doing in the near future is shifting to a different name, probably something akin to Roundabout Games, just because right now that's how I feel in terms of how I'm sort of proceeding through the RPG space, where there's an idea that I had at the beginning, which was we can do anything we want. Maybe not screw the mechanics, but the mechanics should be there to enable us to tell this story, and not the other way around. We shouldn't be fighting the mechanics to tell a story. We should be, having the mechanics support what we're trying to do. And so, we start with the explosion of Reese's, where I'm like, okay, well, this makes sense. And then we sort of, start getting across to games like BRP and Mythras, which again make me start to understand why things like D&D function as they do. So there is this appreciation. Once I start to hit the D100 thing, I go, oh, so you can use mechanics in certain ways to make the kind of thing that you want to do, function. So as for the rest of the plans for the channel, I'll obviously be doing maybe sort of a short, whether it might be an encounter or a small adventure with either BRP or Mythras as the sort of the leading part there. I'm still yet to be decided, but obviously would be interested in hearing your thoughts on obviously either of the systems or any of the systems that I've mentioned today. And yeah, I suppose there it just goes to show that in 3 years you can develop so much as a player and as a referee, to the point where, I look back on the video that I posted 3 years ago and go, well, there's just been a lot of change, and that's really healthy. So uh, anyway, I'm out. If you obviously enjoyed this video, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.